Tonight's presentation will include some inside overviews of the highly advanced and sophisticated airplanes designed and developed in Lockheed's famous Skunk Works. Skunk Works operated from 1954 to 1991. Ben Rich is going to touch on the U-2s, the Blackbird series, the D-21s, which incidentally we're getting one of momentarily, the F-117A program, and the YF-22. He's going to talk about the backgrounds and methods of operation, and he'll do this by, in the short conversations I've had with him today, some interesting anecdotes and incidents, and most importantly, the personal experiences of those events. All these exotic airplanes were secretly operated, as you know, and only revealed in the last decade. Ben Rich became a consultant to Lockheed and Rand Corporation after retiring from Lockheed on January 1, 1991. He became president of the Lockheed Advanced Development Company with its creation in May of 1990. Also known as the Skunk Works, LADC is noted for the development of advanced aircraft. Rich had served as executive vice president and general manager of advanced development projects, Lockheed LADC's official name until May of 1990, when it was still part of the Lockheed Aeronautical Systems Company. Prior to that, he was ADP's vice president and general manager since 1975, except for a 2-year interim assignment as president of the Advanced Aeronautics Company from March 85 to August 86. Ben Rich joined Lockheed in 1950, and he participated in the aerodynamic, thermodynamic, and propulsion and preliminary design aspects of the 104, the U-2, the YF-12, and the SR-71, and numerous other technologically sophisticated programs that have earned ADP international recognition. He's a fellow of the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, and he won that organization's National Aircraft Design Award in 1972. He's also a fellow of the Institute for the Advancement of Engineering and a member of Tau Beta Pi, the National Honorary Professional Engineering Society. Rich and the entire Lockheed and Air Force team were awarded the 1989 Collier Trophy for the production and deployment of the F-117A stealth fighter. He has received numerous other awards and is a member of the board of directors of GEC Marconi Materials and a consultant for Lockheed, the Atomic Energy Commission, Litton, Rand, and the Don Hicks Associates. In January of 1992, Ben received the Howard Hughes Memorial Trophy from the Aero Club of Southern California and an Eaker Fellowship in the Aerospace Education Foundation from the Air Force Association. It's a distinct pleasure to present to you our lecturer tonight, our speaker tonight, Mr. Ben Rich. Ben?
Thank you. Thank you, Colonel. My mother would have loved you. But before I get started tonight, I've got to always tell a couple of jokes to get you in the right mood. And I don't know, many of you have heard them, probably heard me before. So I'll tell you a couple just to get you in the right mood. This is the one about this gent who told his wife to never call him at work. Never call me at work. Well, one day he's sitting there, and at 8:30 in the morning, and the phone rings, and there's his wife on the, hello, honey? He says, didn't I tell you not to call me at work? He says, honey, the car won't start, and I can't take the kids to school. He says, what am I, Mr. Goodwrench? He says, why don't you call the garage or Joe next door? 2 hours later, the phone rings again. Hello, honey? He says, what now? She says, the washing machine is bouncing all around and leaking. He says, what am I, Mr. Maytag? He says, call the plumber or Joe next door. He walks in his house that night, and the wife is smiling. So he comes on over and kisses her and says, you know, hi, honey, how was it? How was your day? She says, fine. And he says, oh, by the way, what did you do about the car? Oh, he says, I called Joe next door. He came over with his wire brush. He brushed those cables. That car started immediately. It's running better now than it ever ran before. Oh, that's great. And by the way, what did you do about the washing machine? Oh, I called Joe next door. He came over with his wrench. He leveled it, tightened the valves. It's quieter now than since we bought it. Oh, that's great. And by the way, he says, what did Joe want for all this work? Well, he asked me if I'd bake him a chocolate cake or sleep with him. So, well, what did you do? He says, what am I, Betty Crocker? So, okay, now I better get along with the business at hand. If I could have the slides, please. I'm going to talk to you about the Skunk Works, and I better tell you how it all began, and then I've got to find the slide. Oh, back there. Wait, I got to go backwards. I'll get there yet. I'll have to. You got to be an engineer. So I'm going to talk to you about the Skunk Works tonight, and I use the Skunk Works because that's a term that's in the dictionary, and so it's a pretty formal word. But I'll tell you how it came to be. The Skunk Works was founded by Kelly Johnson, who was my predecessor and mentor. I mean, Kelly founded the Skunk Works in 1943 to build the first P-80. And Kelly built that airplane in 143 days. From the day he got the contract, the day it first flew. And in those days, the Skunk Works was just a gathering of a bunch of 35 mechanics or something like that. The engineering and stuff was done outside. And Kelly would form these groups, open and close them. And it was really sort of a loose organization. However, in 1954, in 1945, Kelly formally participated in a competition, and he won the competition to build the first production jet fighter. And that airplane was the P-80. And this is Kelly's definition of what makes the Skunk Works. And you can all read that for yourself. I'm going the wrong way. Well, the question then came, well, why do we call it the Skunk Works? Well, in those days, when Kelly did the P-80, he had no place to build it, and he had to build this thing in secret. So what he did was he erected a circus tent, and he erected the circus tent next to our plastic shop, right in the middle of summer. And for those of you who are old enough, there was a comic called Little Abner, drawn up by Al Camp. And Al Camp had two of the characters in this were the Little Indian Joe and Big Barn Smell. And they used to brew a thing called Kickapoo Joy Juice, which they cut up skunks, and they called their still the Skunk Works, or Skunk Works, S-K-O-N-K Works. Well, the guys who were the 30 or 30 some odd engineers working in the big tent, this is all before my time, it was hot, got this exhaust, and the place smelled like a gymnasium. And Kelly, would keep these guys busy as heck because they had to turn out the airplane in 143 days, so they were busy all the time. Well, you know how it is in the summer, guys get irritable and they get phone calls, and so one day, the guy gets a phone call, and he answers the thing, Skunk Works, because it smelled bad, and everybody wanted to know what was Kelly brewing in this tent. And the name just stuck with us, and stunk. Well, in 1961, when I was there already in management, I got a call from the publishers of Little Abner, and said, Mr. Rich, that word Skunk Works is a registered word. You cannot use it. So what we did was we changed the word from Skunk Works to Skunk Works. And we registered it and put a patent on it. And it became a registered word. And then, of course, my good friend Tom Peters, went and picked it up in his book, In Search of Excellence, and uses us as an example. And then he named his company the Skunk Works Company. And I called him up and complained about it, and he says, I want to make you famous. I said, I don't need your famous thing. I want to stay low-key. And he says, I said, I'm going to sue you. He says, go on. I'm in a different business. You're going to lose. So our lawyers gave up, and he still calls his company the Skunk Works. But as a result of that, we are now in the dictionary, in the Random House Dictionary, for a system that is efficient, that does things on cost and on schedule. And that's the origination of the Skunk Works. And I can just say, you can see the number of airplanes that we have done over the last 50 years. And so some of those are done under Kelly's regime. And we have a mandatory retirement law, a rule for officers of the company that when you're 65, you have to leave. And with Kelly, we came 65 in 1965. He had to leave, or 1975, excuse me. So, and then I was lucky to be one of his two right hands, and I was the younger one, I guess, and for some reason he chose me, and I became his successor. And I ran the Skunk Works from 1975 till 91, in January of 91, because then I was 65 years old, and they told me I had to leave. And so I think that's a good rule. It gives a chance for the opportunity, and Sherm Mullen has taken my place. But in those years, I worked in the Skunk Works. I came to Lockheed in 1950, and Kelly called me over in December of 54. So now let me go into our airplanes. In 1954, President Eisenhower of the United States offered to Premier Khrushchev of the USSR an open skies proposal. It was summarily rejected. Now, Kelly had heard about this, and we had been working on a proposal. We had heard that there was a requirement for a high-altitude airplane. We had heard that the Air Force had taken some Canberra airplanes and put some big wings on them here at Wright Field. We had also heard that they were thinking of giving an airplane to Bell. So we went ahead and designed an airplane. And we proposed it, and Kelly had gathered the 15 engineers and about 20 shop people, and we completed the design of the airplane. And Kelly submitted it to the CIA, and on December 1st, 1954, Kelly received an order to build 20 airplanes called the U-2A. He came in and walked in his mailbox one day, and in his mailbox was a check for $2 million to C.L. Kelly Johnson. This is a down payment, build me 20 airplanes, and it had a spec of 2 pages long. Eight months later, on August the 1st, 1955, we had our first flight, 8 months. 4 months after that, we delivered it to the customer. And 4 months after that, we made our first operational flight. I can't get a letter out of the Pentagon in 16 months. Now, the U-2A was a 17,000-pound single-placed airplane powered by a single J57 Pratt & Whitney engine, turbojet engine. The airplane was designed to fly at 7/10 Mach number at altitudes above 65,000 feet. Now, the airplane, once again, was designed in 1954, and to this very day, the max altitude is still classified. Why? I don't know, but it's still classified, and I want to keep my clearances, and I can't tell you its max altitude. The airplane carried about 1,100 pounds of payload, mostly photographic equipment. The aircraft had a wingspan of 80 feet, and from the very first flight, we made the first flight over Russia on July the 4th, 1956. It was the first over Moscow. We had flown over Poland and all the other places prior to that, but the first flight over Moscow was on July 4th, 1956. Now, the U-2 is flying somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 feet above all the Russian fighters. Now, due to its success, people kept adding weight to it. And airplanes are much like people. They all tend to gain weight with time. And within 2 years, our airplane was now at 24,000 pounds with the same engine. So Kelly went and, you know, you lose altitude with weight, and of course the guys started to get closer and closer to the other fighters, and you know, the color of blood turns to brown when you see these guys trying to shoot at you. And so they came to us and we said, why don't we change the engine? So we proposed to our customer in 1956 that we put in the J75 engine. The customer agreed, and we installed excuse me, I'm going the wrong, pressed the wrong button. We installed a new engine, and all we had to do is we had to cut the inlet duct back and cut the hole in the back end to make it bigger. And so this way we increased the airflow for the inlet and in the engine, and now we gained this additional thrust. We regained all our lost altitude. We call this airplane the U-2C. Now, this is the airplane that Gary Powers was shot down in, this airplane, this type of an airplane. Unfortunately, the power plant thrust did not match the aerodynamic design. So this U-2C, although it was making tremendous records every time it flew, it had a marvelous cruise envelope of 4 knots. If you went 2 knots too fast, you ran into Mach Buffet. And if you ran 2 knots too slow, you got into stall Buffet. So it was not the easiest airplane to fly. And this airplane operated that way till that ill-fated day on May 1st, 1960, when Francis Gary Powers was shot down. Now, Frank Powers was shot down, and this is Ben Rich's version, is because, you know, in those days we started to use some ECM. Some people call it ECM, and Ben Rich calls it missile suckers. Because we put a missile sucker here. And lo and behold, instead of spoofing the missile, it attracted the missile. And the missile missed the airplane and hit somewhere here. But it blew off his tail. And airplanes don't fly very well without any tail. And guess what happened? The airplane flipped over, and Gary Powers had to get out. He couldn't, this airplane was spinning and he couldn't reach the D-ring. So what he did was he uncoupled the canopy, uncoupled his seatbelt, and fell out. As he was coming down, he looked on the horizon, and there he saw another parachute. The Russians had shot one of their airplanes down. Now, Gary told me that when he was drunk, because Gary didn't want to talk about the flight very much. Because when he got out of after 3 years in the prison camp, we hired him at Lockheed, and he very seldom talk about what happened. But anyhow, he told me he saw another parachute, and I reported to the CIA, and they said, no. Well, last year, in this Glasnost deal, the Russians admitted they shot their airplane down also. So they got 2 that day. Gary? Okay, therefore, so there this airplane was, we had this wonderful airplane, but it was an awfully hard airplane to fly. So in 1965, Kelly then proposed a scaled-up version of this airplane, and we scaled it up 40%. And we called this airplane the U-2R, and the wingspan went from 80 feet to 100 feet, and the tail grew proportionately. So before we built this airplane, I went to see this guy, Whitcomb, and down at Langley, and I said, Whitcomb, you know, I'm going to build this airplane, and it has an L over D of 26.5. I'd like to put a new wing on it. So Whitcomb says, oh, give me a few weeks, and I'll get you a new wing. Yeah, he get me a new wing, but he increased the drag 40 counts. And so, sure, I got an airplane that would go a little faster, but it was much draggier. So what we did was we just scaled everything up, and we now got an airplane that was 40% power. We call this airplane the U-2R. We improved the cockpit. We improved the avionics. And in 1967 it flew, and these airplanes were properly matched, and at least we had about a 25 knot flight envelope. So in spite of the increased wingspan and payload, the Air Force, the airplane performed very, very well. And this is the airplane. We still have them flying today, and they are in operation today, and these airplanes are very good. Now, the airplanes are stationed at Beale Air Force Base in California. That's their headquarters. And we have them deployed all over the world, and you sleep well at night because they are deployed all over the world, because today they're just as important. We even have some today that are stationed in Saudi Arabia. But we had 2 of them in Cyprus. We have 2 of them in Osan. We have some in Patrick. We have some in Panama. We have them all over the world. In 1966, Kelly and I went to, excuse me, that was, 1976. Kelly and I went to see General Dave Jones, and we proposed a tactical reconnaissance version of this airplane. And the Air Force and the Army ran a joint study of it. They concluded that the U-2 characteristics were exactly what they wanted. So in 1967, we received the contract to reopen the U-2 line to build 35 aircraft. However, General Jones said, Ben, God damn it, I'm not going to have another spy plane. I'm going to change the name. I said, General, I believe in the golden rule. He who controls the gold controls the rule. You can call it anything you want to, sir. He says, I want to call it the TR-1 because it's the Tactical Reconnaissance 1. I said, gosh, you can call it the Tactical Reconnaissance 1 anytime. So anyhow, the airplane, we called it TR-1. It had the same dimensions as the U-2R, but now it carried 4,000 pounds of payload, and it had these big pods. And it was doing all types of recce, real-time recce, and then, of course, had the defensive systems. But now the gross weight is up to 40,000 pounds, and they're flying that way. Now, even though it decreased the altitude, the airplane is still very, very successful. And right after the Powers incident, the President of the United States, Eisenhower, forbid all overflights. And so all the flights are peripheral anyhow, so I could afford to lose the altitude. But now we do all this reconnaissance real time, and of course they were very, very effectively used in Desert Storm. Now, it's not common knowledge, but all the U-2s and the TR-1s are all carrier capable. Now, we take off the carriers without the catapult, and we land, we can't slow the carrier down slow enough because of this very, very high L over D. And then we come in, and the biggest thing we worry about is the burble we get off of that deck, the thing, you know, sitting on the deck. So, but the airplanes are very carrier capable. We just attach a hook to the bottom of it. The reason we did that is that the French were running their tests in the South Pacific, which was way beyond our range. We had no bases around there, so we had to use the aircraft carrier as a refueler. But that's the reason we did that. So now, within the last 4 or 5 months, the Air Force, when you guys changed your names, you're now the Mobility Command and the different commands. All the U-2s now belong to Mike Lowe. And Mike Lowe decided he didn't want U-2s and TR-1s and things. He says, let's make things easy. So all the airplanes now are called U-2s. And since he pays the bill, all our airplanes are now U-2s. They look all alike. Anyhow, they're now all U-2s. And we use the U-2s to do strategic missions, and we use TR-1s to do tactical missions, and we're slowly converting them so they do everything the same. Now, we did, the one thing that Dave Jones forgot to do is when I told him to buy 35 airplanes, I thought he'd buy them at 12 a year. No, what did they do? They bought them at 4 a year. So we had to build those airplanes at 1 a season. You ever try to build an airplane 1 a season? And then when they stopped building these in about 1988, 87, the congressional guy, Stafford, came to me and asked me if I would build one a year. I said, God, I mean, you guys are crazy. Anyhow, we built them on a learning curve, and we learned how to build airplanes slowly in the Skunk Works. In late 1957, as soon as this airplane started, the U-2 started to fly, the government realized that the survival life of the U-2 was short. I didn't think the U-2s would fly more than 2 years without getting shot down. So we immediately decided to build a U-2 replacement. And they insisted that we build an airplane that was radar-proof, because the Russians were tracking us every flight. You know, they would fly these 15 or 20 airplanes underneath the U-2s, and many times the pilots would fly for 6, 8, or 10 hours and come back with just pictures of Russian MiG-15s and MiG-19s underneath them, because they'd fly in relays underneath us. So we had to get smart and maneuver and get rid of these guys. And so they decided that, hey, you ought to try to make the U-2 stealthy. Well, we tried everything. We put coatings, we put vanes, we put every little thing you could think of, and we couldn't make the U-2 stealthy. So we started with a clean sheet of paper to build a low observable, highly survivable airplane. And Kelly's design team generated a Mach 3 design that flew Mach 3 plus above 85,000 feet. It was a single-place, low observable airplane, and we call this airplane the A-12. Now, the reason we call it the A-12 was we started out, our name for the U-2 was the Angel, and this airplane was the Archangel. And it started out at A-1, was Kelly's first trip. And the next trip he went to Washington, we had a different little improved design, he called it A-2. Well, he sold it on his 12th trip, so the airplane was called A-12. Well, we were in competition at that time with Convair had an airplane that they were going to launch off. It was called Kingfisher off. See, all the airplanes that by the way, we sell in the Skunk Works are usually won by competition. And so we get no free ride that most people think. In the press, they often refer this as the A-11 because the President of the United States called it the A-11. The Blackbird series of airplanes consisted of 3 airplanes: the A-12, the YF-12, and you notice this airplane is different, and we built 3 of these, and this, we took the chine off the leading edge, and once we took the chine off the leading edge, we lost our stability, and so this airplane has 5 tails, 2 on top and 3 on the bottom, and you have one of these in your museum. There's only one left. And we had a contract to build more of these, but McNamara, the Congress had appropriated $50 million for 3 years in a row for us. But in those days, the Secretary of Defense, who was Robert McNamara, refused to spend the money. And so we didn't build the airplanes. By the way, we were turning these airplanes out in 1967 for $17 million apiece. And that's building them by the season. Anyhow, the 3rd airplane we built, I'm pressing the wrong thing, was the SR-71. Now, this airplane was really the RS-71 because they had built the RS-70, and this was the RS-71. But the President of the United States, when he announced it, he called it the SR-71. Well, the President can't make a mistake. So we changed 29,000 drawings, and from reconnaissance strike, it became strategic reconnaissance. And the Air Force then took it over. And this airplane, instead of being single place, it was 2-place because the workload started to get much more difficult. And we started to do all types of reconnaissance. And it grew in weight from 120,000 pound takeoff gross weight to 140,000 pounds. This airplane carries 40 tons of fuel. 40 tons of fuel. It carries fuel from back here to there and in the wing halfway. So that's a lot of fuel. And the rest of it is an airplane. But it was the first stealth airplane. It was powered by two J58 Pratt & Whitney bypass turbojet engines. It carried a 2,000-pound payload. Initially, that was the original A-12. Today, it carries 4,000 pounds. It's built 85% titanium and 15% high-temperature composite. And it was the first low-observable airplane. This airplane has a cross-section, radar cross-section, smaller than a T-38. It had its first flight, the A-12, on April the 26th, 1962, over 30 years ago. It became operational and was used in Vietnam in 1965. It was followed by the Interceptor version. We built 3 of those, as I told you. And then we followed that with the SR-71. I'm going to back up and show you the Interceptor, because that was the first look-down, shoot-down radome airplane. We fired GAR missiles, which were the predecessors of the Hughes Phoenix missiles. And we shot airplanes at Mach 3 and 3.5 at ranges over 100 miles, from sea level to 40,000 feet. Every fire shot was a direct hit. It was fired by Colonel Stevens, for those of you who know the old Gray Fox, who used to be at Edwards Air Force Base. Unfortunately, he passed away a couple of years ago. So it was a very successful airplane. On December the 23rd, 1964, we flew this airplane. Now, this was a two-place version. The principal design challenge in all these Blackbirds was the structural design temperature. Because on all these Blackbirds, the leading edge of the airplane is at 800 degrees. And the average surface temperature on the airplane is at 550 degrees. Now, for those of you in the audience who don't understand temperature, 800 degrees is the temperature of a soldering iron. And 550 degrees is the temperature you get in your oven when you turn it on at the broiler. So it wasn't easy, but one of the hardest jobs I had was the Air Force insisted that I paint the stars and bars and U.S. Air Force on it. So I said, who in the hell is going to be at 90,000 feet to see me? No, you got to do it. It's in the spec. Well, someday, take a piece of some metal, paint it, and stick it in your broiler, and see if you can keep the paint on. Well, white turns to gray, blue turns to purple, and red turns to maroon. So it cost us $1 million, but we developed the paint, and lo and behold, we painted the damn thing red, white, and blue. Don't laugh. That airplane had to meet the Arizona road dust requirement. And I said, you know, when am I going to run into Arizona road dust? You know, we used to run into road dust when, you know, because the atomic tests, you know, used to be external, and we used to big these big clouds up, and occasionally there'd be Arizona road dust maybe at 85,000 feet. You know, we keep running into insects at that altitude because there's a jet stream up there at the top of the tropopause. And our airplane's a hell of a good bug catcher, just like your windshield. And, you know, we'd catch all these black dots on our windshield, we'd scrape them off, and they were all, they were insects, burned up, you know, to a crisp, because at Mach 3, stagnation temperature was 800 degrees. So it's kind of interesting. And our biggest threat was these damn weather balloons. You know, these weather balloons that would fly over, you know, Alamogordo and all these other, they'd put these damn things they'd have these barometric things with chains about, you know, with a wire about an inch in diameter, and you'd fly, you know, and you're traveling at 2,500 miles an hour, you don't see these damn things. And, you know, we missed a couple of them by maybe 100 feet, 200 feet, many times. So we had to then start to avoid these places and try to find out when they put up their weather balloons. Because, you know, if we ever hit a wire, that thing, we just cut the wing off. So anyhow, that was the problem. You know, then we had to design a composite that would stand, because the entire periphery of this airplane is composite. And you know, composites at 800 degrees, they ain't easy, fellas. And the inlets, the tails are all composite. And that's how we got our stealth. They were all loaded honeycomb composite. Now remember, that airplane we built in 1962. So that's when we started our stealth work in the Skunk Works. So we weren't too green at this darn thing. So it was the first low observable airplane with 17% of the airplane with structural, which was in composite. Now we canted the vertical tails inward 15 degrees, not for aerodynamics, but for radar cross-section. We originally put the chines on for radar cross-section, but we got so much aerodynamic lift from it that it acted as a fixed canard, and we took advantage of it, and we told everybody we were geniuses, you know. We put canards on airplanes way beyond, but really we had put it on for radar cross-section. But we just fell in it, you know, serendipity. Occasionally you fall in and come out smelling like a rose, you know. And it unloaded the darn fuselage, and of course we took credit for it. So I'm going to go back to the airplane and point out something to you about the airplane. I went the wrong way. Wait, I'm going the wrong way. I got to reverse this thing. I got this. I know this, somehow it's not working. There I am. Okay. Let me tell you how we designed it. Can you all hear me? Is this mic working? Everybody hear me? Well, first place, when we were doing this airplane, we didn't know where to put the inlet. And everybody said, hey, you know, they're designing an airplane called the B-70, and they got square inlets. He says, how come these inlets are round? Well, I said, I've never seen a pressure vessel that's square. Have anybody seen a square water heater? And I said, I'm going to build a round thing because the pressure ratio across the inlet is 40 to 1. I get most of my thrust in this airplane from the inlet. We get about 65% of our thrust from the inlet. We get 15% at this at cruise speed, 15% from the engine, and the remainder from the ejector. And we located the inlet so that the shock wave that came off the nose missed the inlet lip. And that's how we located the inlet, where it should be. Because we didn't want to put it, I'd like to have had it away from the fuselage as much as possible, but at that time, I don't know how many are old enough to remember, a B-58 lost 2 engines and it swapped ends. And I was afraid that if we ever lost an engine here, we'd swap ends here. And this thing was operating with inlets that were supersonic and had the shock waves going in and out. And often and early in the program, we kept losing engines. So we had to design the engine that every time it had an unstart, we would sympathetically unstart the other side. Anyhow, so we had all movable verticals. And then, since the airplane grew in flight, the entire wing here is corrugated. Because we had to make sure that any time the airplane would grow, any of the distortion would always be in the streamwise direction. Otherwise, you'd get shock waves off the wing and we'd lose our lift. As it is, our L over D on this airplane was about 6.7, 6.8 at cruise speeds. So it was a fairly good airplane. And we got smart, and then I had designed the inlet wrong. I did the inlet. I was responsible for the inlet. I had the inlet down 6.5 degrees, and after I ran about 10,000 points, I found out that the flow coming off the front end of the airplane was coming into the inlet this way. So I had to take the inlets and rotate them 15 degrees. And if you ever look at the airplane, you'll notice the struts are at strange angles. Some guy says, what are you, idiotic? How come you do that? Well, I'd already run 10,000 points, and it cost me $10,000 an hour to run these damn points. So I couldn't afford to rerun them. So that's the way at the airplane. I didn't dare change them, because Kelly had a rule. You always build what you test, and you always will be right. Well, anyhow, it was the most darn efficient airplane in the world, and we never lost an SR-71 where we lost a man. No pilot in the United States Air Force was ever lost. It's the only airplane that in peacetime and wartime, we never lost a man, the United States Air Force. It was a magnificent airplane.
Unfortunately, we had to retire the airplane 2 years ago, and but just before I convinced the chief of staff we ought to establish the world's record, and we flew from LA to Washington in 64 minutes. Now, I could have done it in 60 minutes, but Larry Wells wouldn't let me do it. And he said we had to fly by handbook. And then, of course, we ran into a hot day. And so we did it in 64 minutes. And we went from ocean to ocean in 68 minutes. But we could have done it in 60 if they let me go over Los Angeles at Mach 3. They only let me go over at 2.5. So they were afraid I'd make it too big a sonic boom. But anyhow, we'd still got there in time, and then they wouldn't let me fly around Washington. And so I said, well, you let the space shuttle fly around the Capitol. No, you got to land. So that's what we did. Since they own the airplane and I have to work with the Air Force, I have to salute once in a while. And they call me FBR, not for friendly, Ben Rich. But anyhow, that was a very successful airplane, and it's amazing. There are three of them left, and two of them are flying at NASA, doing research for NASA for the NASP program, and they're going to do external burning and some of the else. Okay. Now, since we were limited to overflying with both the U-2 and the SR-71, Kelly decided that in the early 60s, we would propose an unmanned airplane. So we proposed to the Air Force, I've got to get to it. We proposed a drone to the Air Force. And what we did was we went to Marquardt and said, you know, you got a lot of leftover Beaumark engines, ramjets. How would you like to take that, make one of those Beaumark engines and let us fly it? And now they had never flown a ramjet engine for more than about a minute and a half, because most of these things were missiles, and you know the reason they call them missiles is that they miss. Someday we're going to call them Hittles when they can hit. But we decided to use these leftover engines, and we put them in this bird, and it was a bird that was 17,000 pounds, and we started to launch them off the SR-71. It was tremendous. This darn thing, we took it up through the drag rides, you know, and all the way up to 85,000 feet, and we launched it. And lo and behold, the damn thing went to about 3.8 Mach number, and about 100,000 feet, and went forever. Went almost 4,000 miles. Oh, that was terrific. So I said, hey, that was terrific. I got a contract to build 55 of them. Well, it was great, but on the 7th flight, this had an inlet. The inlet unstarted, but it only unstarted on one side of the inlet. It was a fixed inlet. I was cheap because we were throwing these things away. All these were drones, so they would fly and then come back and drop a package, and we'd fly a C-130 and would grab it. And by the way, one of the pilots who was flying those C-130s was a fellow by the name of Dick Schofield, who later became a program manager on our SR-71. And so they would fly, and they'd go pick up these packages, just like we used to pick up the packages from outer space. Well, that was great, but the problem is we lost, when the airplanes lost, it had its unstart, it yawed, and the mother and daughter airplane collided. As a result of that, we lost both airplanes. Well, Kelly decided we couldn't afford to do that anymore, because a man by the name of Robert McNamara made us cut up the tools on the SR-71, and we sold them for 7.5 cents a pound, and we couldn't build any more SR-71s. So Kelly said, gee, I can't afford to lose any more of these. Ben, you got to change launching this damn thing. Try a B-52. And, you know, I salute the boss. I said, okay. So 1 year later, took us 1 year, we developed a rocket and launched them off the B-52. And very successfully. We launched it at 35,000 feet, it's about 7/10 Mach number, and it flew up to 95,000 feet and started to cruise, dropped the rocket and cruised for close to 4,000 miles. Well, very successful program. We had them stationed at Beale Air Force Base. And guess who was one of the pilots of this airplane? a guy by the name of Fain. Some of you have heard of General Fain. Someday ask him, he flew a B-52. You know, today he's a fighter pilot. He forgets that he flew the B-52s that launched these things, stationed up at Beale Air Force Base. Anyhow, we built these and we stationed them up at Beale. And I was surprised. I never saw it in aviation leak. They must have thought that we were launching hound dogs or something. Because here we had these sitting there. Well, we used to fly these, and we flew them all the way into and launch them into China. And they flew very successful. You know, we had quite a few flights. We used to fly them, in our test flights, we'd fly from Barking Sands to Midway, turn around, and come back and grab the package off of Kauai. I don't think it's there today. But anyhow, it was a very successful. We flew 3 of these into China. The reason we were flying into China is because of Lop Nor. Lop Nor was where they were developing the Chinese hydrogen bomb, and we were going to see what they were doing. Anyhow, you're going to get one of these. We got 17 of them left, and the only reason I had to reveal it is because the Air Force, in their infinite wisdom, when they closed the program down, they parked them 100 feet at Davis-Monthan from Route 66. And somebody climbed over the fence and took a picture of them and saw a Lockheed insignia, and they got me on the Freedom of Information Act. Because in those days, we stamped nothing at the Skunk Works, because nobody wanted to read anything that wasn't secret. So I could walk around and travel all over without having this double rule, and, you know, changes all these things. And, of course, they changed the law on me later on, so I had to go back and stamp everything. But anyhow, they got me, and of course we had to reveal it. And there's 17 of these left at Davis-Monthan, and they're going to give you a couple here. And the mother airplane off that SR-71 is that if you ever go up to Boeing, the Boeing Flight Museum, the airplane that launched one of them that didn't crash, we had 2 of them modified, is at Boeing, and they're hoping to get one of these to put on top of the airplane on the SR-71. But anyhow, that was a very, very successful program, and it was very, very stealthy. In fact, it was so stealthy that about 15 years ago, or 10 years ago, one day the CIA came to me with a piece about yay big. And they said, "Ben, have you ever seen this before?" And I said, "Sure." I looked at it. I said, "Yeah, this is off our D-21. I said, "Where in the hell did you get it?" They said, "We got it from the KGB." I said, "KGB?" I said, "Where they?" You know, I launched the last time I launched this thing was 1967. This was 1983 or something like that. He says, "Yeah." I said, "You know, one of them we didn't get back. You know, one of them flew into Lop Nor, which is Chinese Siberia, and didn't turn around. It kept going, and we lost it. But what happened to it, I suspect, and this is all my suspect, it flew into and ran out of fuel in Russian Siberia, in Mongolia. And it probably ran out of fuel and exploded and got covered up by the snow for many, many years. And what happened was they had a warm winter, and somebody climbing a mountain, one of their natives, Sherpas or something, found the piece, turned it into the KGB. They exploited it, and they said, that is the type of work that the Skunk Works is doing in stealth. Well, you know, we are about 1,000 times better than that. But anyhow, they gave it to the CIA to nudge, you know, just to nudge them. And the guy brought them, and unfortunately, they took it back. I don't have the piece, but it was a remarkable thing that the Russians thought, and I was happy that they thought that was our stealth program. But we had done it something about 25 years earlier. Okay, well, that's that airplane. In 1975, we had a breakthrough. One of my guys came to me, and I had just taken over the Skunk Works, and I was hungry to try to be a hero. And they came to me, and they said they had solved the Maxwell equations using a Russian equation by a fellow named Ufimtsev, who, by the way, is now teaching at UCLA. And the guy didn't know it, but he had solved an equation, and 2 of my guys one of the things I forgot to tell you is, by the way, we did the SR-71 with a slide rule and a Frieden. And so we can only do things with the tools we have. Well, in this airplane, these guys developed a two-dimensional analog solution to this guy's equation. You know, these things with a whole bunch of violin signs. And those of you who are mathematicians know what I'm talking about. But anyhow, I would know it from an atom. And anyhow, but we could only get a two-dimensional solution. So we built a two-dimensional airplane because it worked. That's all. Like the computers that we had in those days could only solve two-dimensional solutions. We didn't have a big enough slide. Well, today, you know, you'll look, I'll show you the F-22. It doesn't have any flat surfaces because I only build what I can calculate. Well, we built this thing. There was a competition called Harvey. And these two guys, Dennis Overholser and Bill Schroeder, had developed this, and I built a model. And I built a model about 6 or 8 feet long, and I took it to the McDonnell Douglas range, and I put this thing on the range. And lo and behold, the guy, we put it there one Saturday, and the guy said, "You know, Mr. Rich, you guys dropped your model." I said, "What do you mean?" He says, "It doesn't show on our radar." And I said, "What?" And I picked up the binoculars, and he says, "Just a minute, just a minute." He says, "There's something. We now pick it up." Well, what happened was a bird landed on our model. And he picked up the bird. Well, I got kind of excited, as you well can see. And I picked up the phone and I called Mel Curry. I think it was DDR&E that time. Or he was DDR&E. And I said, "You know, Mel, we got something that's pretty damn good." And he says, "Come on back here and show me." And I showed it to him. And then he sent me over to Heilmeyer. He says, "You know, there's a competition at DARPA called Harvey. It's unclassified." So I went over to see George Heilmeyer and his program manager called Ken Perko. And I said, "I'd like to get in the competition, but you never invited me." Well, he says, "You're not in the fighter business. We only send money out to the fighter people. And you, Lockheed, haven't built a fighter since the 104. And I said, "I know. I'd like to get back in it." And he says, we don't have any more money." I said, "Okay, fine." He says, "But I'll give you $1 and I'll put you under contract." I said, "Time." I said, No, then you'll own everything. I will do it for $0, but I want to just be allowed to enter." Well, we entered the competition, and they narrowed it down to 2 competitors, Lockheed and Northrop. And they gave us each $5 million to each build a full-scale model of what we proposed. And Northrop and I built a full-scale model of this airplane, and we brought it down to Ratscat to test it. Well, the thing had so small a radar cross-section that they couldn't measure it at Ratscat. So they came to Lockheed and Northrop and said, "You know, we can't measure this on our pole is too big. The pole is giving a bigger signal. Can you and Northrop buy us a pole so we can test this damn thing?" So Northrop and I put together the money, and Northrop and I, we designed it, Lockheed built it, and we built the pole that's at Ratscat today, because the government couldn't afford it. So then I won the competition, and I went back to DARPA and I said, "Okay, now they said build us 2 airplanes." So I said, "Yeah, that's terrific. I'll build you 2 airplanes." He says, "How much is it going to be?" I said, $30 million. That's 2 airplanes and 2 years of testing. "What?" he says. He says, "I only have $10 million. I said, "But it's cost $30 million to build these 2 airplanes. Well, he says, "You better find some airplanes." So I called Al Slay up, who was at that time, he was the head of R&D in the Pentagon. I said, "Al, let me come on over and show you the data." So I went over to see Al Slay and showed him the data. And of course, I got him all excited. And he says, "I can give you $10 million. Well, 10 and 10 only adds up to 20. And guess when? 1974. And 1974, 75, is when Rolls-Royce went belly up. And Lockheed had 10 gliders called L-1011s. So this guy who had just become, head of the Skunk Works goes to the chairman of the board and says, I need $10 million. They said, are you crazy? We're going to go ask for a loan guarantee and we might go out of business, I showed them what it is. I said, this thing is the greatest thing since sliced bread. So they said, okay, you can go and present it to the board of directors. We'll support you. So I went to our board of directors at Lockheed and I got $10 million. So for $30 million, we built 2 of these airplanes and we flew them for 2 years. Well, they did everything they said we were going to do. We had lowered, in engineering, if you get a 10 or 20% improvement, you think you're doing marvelous. Well, we got a 10,000% improvement, 4 orders of magnitude. Well, the day I showed them the data, this airplane went black, deep black. If you thought Manhattan Project was dark, this thing was darker. And we went, and everybody had to be cleared secret. You know what a clear 10,000, I didn't at that time, I didn't have 10,000, I had about 1,500 people in the Skunk Works at that time. And I had to clear 1,500 people secret. And, you just can't clear that many people. But we did. And we kept the secret. And we flew these 2 airplanes, and it was very successful. And as a result of that, General Slay created an office called the Low Observable Office, and he picked Bobby Bond to head it up. And Bobby had just made BG. Bobby picked 5 brilliant majors and colonels. And there were Joe Williams, Ken Staton, many of you know, he headed NASP, and then he just retired, he headed up Eglin Air Force Base. Joe Ralston, who's now a 3-star general, who is the head of the Alaskan Command. A guy by the name of Schwartz, who is now a 2-star general in charge of the budget in the Pentagon. And a guy by Jerry Baber, who did all the contracts, who now works at our Lockheed Ontario. He retired from the Air Force. And these 5 guys came to me and said, okay, Ben, we'd like you to build or study 2 fighters. We want you to, I said, we can only build airplanes with the engines we have. So I can either build you an airplane that is the size of an F-15 or an airplane the size of an F-111. So they gave me $10 million to study it. And out of that, they selected 1 airplane, the one that was the size of the F-15. And they gave me a contract to build 5 of these airplanes, called the F-117. Now, this airplane was terrific. We started to build these airplanes, and the data that we were getting from the models was so fantastic that the Air Force came to me, and this is Al Slay now, and Al Slay, in the meantime, was promoted from his 3-star job at the Pentagon to a 4-star job called AFSC, commander. And Al Slay said, God damn it, I'm not going to leave it at the Pentagon. He took the damn thing to Wright Field. And he opened up an office called the Low Observable SPO, and he chose a guy by the name of Dave England. And I don't know how many of you guys know Dave. He was a marvelous guy, Colonel Dave England. He had been the AMST program manager. And he gave Dave a rule. He says, okay, I am the head of this program, Al Slay. And Dave England, you're program manager, and all you can have is 35 people. And go and work with Rich and get this damn thing built. And then he called me up and he says, okay, Rich, he says, I'll give you a production contract if you'll take it on fixed price. I said, what? The first airplane hadn't flown yet. So it was 17 months before the first airplane flew that I took a production contract for this airplane. And guess what? They were going to produce them at 2 a season. And everybody else is turning these airplanes 12, 15, 20. I was turning out at one time 35 P-38s a day in World War II. And here we're going to build 8 airplanes a year. So, of course, I was hungry. And we decided we'd take the airplane. And we built this airplane. It's airplane that's 50 some odd thousand pounds, 52,000 pounds. And it's the same size as an F-15 because we use the same aerodynamics. The only difference in this is it carries all our stores internally. And it has, of course, twice the range of an F-15 because we can fly at altitude. Now, when you build a stealth airplane, you get most of your stealth from its shape, 60% of it from its shape, and 30% from its coatings. And then you build its coatings like you build a hi-fi set. You have coatings that absorb low frequency, like what we call in the hi-fi set a woofer, and you have coatings that absorb high frequency, and that you have a tweeter, and then we have a crossover network. And so we built this marvelous airplane, and God, it was very, very successful, and we refueled it. It's very independent, and from the day we got the contract in '78, in 5 years, we were an IOC. The entire development program was $725 million. That was 5 airplanes and all the test programs. We built 59 of these airplanes at the average price, and that's building them at 2 a season for about 4 or 5 years. And then the last 2 years, we built them at 1 a season, all on the learning curve. We built this airplane on a 78% learning curve, which was mind-boggling. You know, I went over to see the people at GD when they became our partners in the F-22, and they were turning out something like 25 or 35 F-16s, and Anderson there tells me, hey, you know, Ben, we just got to an 82% learning curve. We're turning these airplanes out at 35 a month. And I said, God, I wish I was as lucky. I turned these airplanes at 2 a season at 78% learning curve. Anyhow, we were very, very lucky. We got, thanks to Al Slay and to the people who followed Al Slay, Larry Scantz, every one of our program managers was a gem. Everyone was sharp. Everyone that they picked on the program was good. And they kept their SPO to 35 people, which made it easy for me because I only needed 35 people to interface with them. So I could keep a small organization, and there was trust. We weren't buddy-buddies. We fought like cats and dogs, but we trusted each other. And when we had a problem, all I had to do was call the SPO up or my program manager, and we settled the thing right away. And if he had a problem, he'd just go to Al Slay, and Al Slay would say, okay, get it fixed. I didn't put you there to give me your problems. Fix the damn problem and get it working. This thing is marvelous. And we were, as I say, very, very fortunate. In fact, I got one of them here, George Zielsdorf, who was a program manager. And George, it was a pleasure working for you. He's been promoted now. He got a lot of airplanes, but he did a hell of a good job. We were very, very fortunate that we had people who thought the same way we did in the Skunk Works. We were success-oriented. And we had our problems. We had our disagreements, but we respected each other. And you know, with the 5 airplanes that I had on this program, our entire test force at the full part of the program was 230 people. And you know why the B-2 is expensive? They had 1 airplane on test, and they had 1,200 people. And they went to 2 airplanes, they went to 1,900 people on the test force. Now you want to know why airplanes cost $2.2 billion each? Too many people. Anyhow, we were very, very successful. We used this airplane in Operation Just Cause, and then we were really lucky. They deployed us to Saudi Arabia. And they deployed 42 of these to Saudi Arabia. And these are the targets they gave us. Unfortunate part of it is they stationed all our airplanes 900 miles from Baghdad, way down here at King Khalid Air Force Base, way down near the Suez Canal, the Red Sea. So we had to have a couple of refuelings, but we were the only airplane in Desert Storm allowed to fly over Baghdad. We were very successful. We were only 2% of the Allied force, and this is an Air Force curve that I use on one mission. They gave us the first night, they gave us the mission to wipe out all the communication in the eyes. On the second night, they had given the mission to the F-15 Echoes. These are F-15 Echoes and F-60, excuse me. I got to go back. These are our F-15s, or F-16s, and these are F-15 Echoes. And the first night they sent these guys over and they couldn't penetrate. So the second night they tried it with precision weapons and again they couldn't penetrate. In fact, on this night they lost 2 F-15 Echoes on this night. So then General Glosser said, gee, what the hell am I going to do? And there was a major from the 37th Fighter Wing says, sir, could you let the F-117s try? So he said, okay. So we took 8 F-117s with 2 tankers and we knocked out their entire nuclear and biological sites that we knew about, because there were some we didn't know about. So that penetrated, and those 10 aircraft did the job of all these other airplanes. Now, this is not my curve. This is a curve of Secretary Rice. So in conclusion, it's the F-117 is combat proven. We still have a squadron of them over there. If they get nasty, we will knock their eyes out again. We attacked 31% of the targets. We were only 2% of the force. We did 40% of the damage. And we did precision bombing. By the way, on that contract that I had with the Air Force, and I made money on it, by the way, in spite of it being fixed price, made lots of money. That's why they call me rich. We guaranteed performance, radar cross-section, and bombing accuracy. Guaranteed it. And we did everything there. Okay, then later on, the Skunk Works went and we designed an airplane called the F-22. And we won the competition. But the government came to us and said, you know, we only have $600 million on this thing, and you guys got to build it in the white world with white world specs, with a white world SPO. Well, I had the Skunk Works, and I said, God, I can't bring all these white world people in it, and I don't have $600 million. Neither does Lockheed. So Lockheed decided to get 2 partners. We got Boeing and General Dynamics, and we went into competition versus Northrop and McDonnell Douglas. We both spent $1.2 billion to build these 2 airplanes. By the way, I forgot to tell you that the entire price of the entire F-117 program for the 59 airplanes, with the development airplanes, was $3 billion. Or I think $2.3 billion. And that's not bad, because when you think that General Motors spent $3.5 billion to develop the Saturn automobile, and that doesn't have to fly. And when you think that, you know, United States spends $6.5 billion a year on dog food, you know, that's the average expenditure on dog food in this country is $6.5 billion, so I don't feel so bad. We spend $4.5 million on popcorn. So when you think we only spent, you know, $2.3 billion for the entire 59 airplanes, plus the things, I thought we did a pretty good job. And it was successful. Anyhow, we got this, and 2 years ago, we won the competition. And now you'll notice that this airplane has the same radar cross-section as the F-117, but notice it doesn't have any flat plates, because now we got Cray computers. We can solve 3-dimensional airplanes. Now, a funny part about it, you see the horizontal tail on the back of that airplane? That horizontal tail is bigger than the wings on the 104. The tail. Now, that airplane is a marvelous airplane. It can fly, you know, it's a fighter and designed for 9Gs. It can fly at any altitude. It can fly supersonic, non-afterburning. It has thrust nozzle control, and it could fly at every altitude. And that's why the tails are so big, because it can fly at very, very slow speeds at any altitude. We demonstrated that airplane over 60 degrees. I can't tell you how far above that, because then old General Fain will put me in jail. And Anyhow, it's a very, very successful airplane if they ever decide to build it. Because we spent $600 million of our own money. It would have been smarter for me to put that in the savings and loan. I'd have made more money. Because they keep delaying the damn airplane. The production airplane, the first one won't fly till '97 now. This thing won't get in IOC till 2007. Can you imagine? They keep delaying the damn thing. They want to know why the thing costs so damn much money. They keep delaying it. Okay, let me go on because it's getting late. I wanted to tell you, I'm going to digress a little bit, because everybody thinks the Skunk Works walks on water. Well, we do, but we know where the stones are. The Skunk Works, as I said, was founded by the late Kelly Johnson. And, and Kelly's philosophy was be quick, be quiet, and be on time. Kelly was both an engineering and management genius. And when I took his place, I was scared shitless. Excuse me. His recipe was get a few good people with integrity, tell them what you need, and that's just communicate with them, and get the hell out of their way. Give them authority with responsibility, and you'd be surprised what they can do. You have to have a leader that takes risk, make decisions, and runs the organization like a benevolent dictator, and never design for 100%. You can't afford it. Remember, best is the enemy of better, but never settle for average. So the Skunk Works method is not a panacea. It works well for prototypes and for low production programs. The engineering and shops must be very closely coupled. The engineers have to talk to the shops. And you've got to use iterative engineering. Some people call it today concurrent engineering. Every design is a compromise. The Skunk Works, or the forte of the Skunk Works, is we fill a niche. We are a cradle-to-grave organization, and you've got to be a part of the system from its concept to its retirement. The secret of the Skunk Works is its attitude. And we make mistakes. This is Kelly Johnson's report card, and you can see that he had some failures. But we lived with them. But more of them were successes. So we do make mistakes. As I was telling somebody at dinner, the first time I flew the U-2, I flew it at 70,000 feet. Well, 70,000 feet is the midst of the ozone layer. Well, all the damn seals leaked because ozone eats rubber. So we took it down and we changed every seal in the airplane to silicone. But I'd forgotten, nobody had been up to 70,000 feet before that. But anyhow, we learned. And we tried all sorts of airplanes. And here, the CL-400 is a hydrogen airplane that someday I'll tell you about. We got more time. We were building a liquid hydrogen airplane in 1955. They had never expected, never run I'd never heard the word cryogenic in my life before. And I went to Kelly, and Kelly said, Ben, we're going to build a liquid hydrogen airplane. I said, liquid hydrogen? That's a laboratory curiosity. He said, Ben Rich, you dumb idiot. He says, it's a steam engine. You burn hydrogen and oxygen, you get water. That's a steam engine. Now get out there and build it. Well, hydrogen, I don't know for those of you know, liquid hydrogen, 50-gallon drum weighs 50 pounds. It's 20 degrees above absolute zero. If you don't think that's a problem. Okay. Now, the Skunk Works approach is not a fad. It's worked many times and been successful. We did the F-104 in the Skunk Works, C-130, U-2, SR-71, F-117s, and many other programs I can't talk about. We're still working very hard. I just can't tell you what we're doing, that's all. You'll have to invite me back in about 10 years, and I'll tell you what we're doing. I'd like to close, though, and tell you that we're a national asset, but I can tell you one job that we just got. The Air Force has just given us a contract to take E.T. back home. Thank you very much.
We all heard what he said, that we can invite him back in 10 years and get the Aurora questions answered. So, Bob Bobbitt, there's one answer to your lecture series in that particular year. But for the meantime, as a token of our appreciation, Ben, for filling us in on some very interesting corners of the technology over the last couple decades, and particularly your Skunk Works approach to it, we've got a little memento from the museum for you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.